Welcome back, everyone. I am here with Thom Didato of Fail Better magazine. Thanks for coming out. Thanks, Thom. How are you doing today?
Thank you for having me.
And we were just talking, Thom is the editor of Fail Better and also reads Russian. So we were just discussing that a little bit. So fun fact. So tell us, Fail Better magazine, you started the journal in 2000.
2000, yeah. Several colleagues and I, we were living in Brooklyn, New York at the time. We were bookstore vagabonds, and we ran a reading series, a popular reading series that was hosted sometimes at the KG Bar and Grill, actually, with a little bit of Russian, and then eventually in Brooklyn at a bar. And several of our folks had started up print literary magazines at that time and had gone belly up after about a year or two. And we were cheap. And so, and we got in on the online literary magazine thing kind of on the ground back in 2000. And so initially it was all a bunch of writers from the Gordonlish school and the fiction thing, but then it quickly branched out. But that's how we started. Yeah, it wasn't like we were, techno guys or anything like that. It was just simply more of a means to an end as far as, and also little did we know that we were going to branch out pretty quickly and get a rather large audience that way.
Yeah. Can you tell us about the Gordonlish School? What is that?
So, Gordonlish, for those like who studied publishing or the history of publishing, probably more famous as an editor than as a writer, although he's a writer in his own right. He was the editor for Carver and a lot of heavy hitters back in the 70s and 80s, Captain Fiction, basically. And he worked in major publishing houses. And so my cohort, whose name is David McClendon, who has run really the last 10 years plus a great literary magazine called Unsaid. He had taken classes because Gordon basically started teaching a lot of writers on his own out of his own apartment, became this kind of almost cult figure. And it was those writers that were featured in this very, very popular reading series. And I approached David and said, hey, have you ever thought, you've got some really, really amazing writers here. Have you ever thought about, starting up a publication just dedicated to this? And that's kind of how we got our start.
And so what was the online lit mag scene like at the time? Was it, did people think it was weird that you were going to start a journal that was just online? Was it sort of looked down upon?
Yeah, it was both of those, which seems kind of archaic nowadays, or it has been really for like the last 10 years plus, maybe more. At that time, there was really only a handful of web-based literary magazines. There was one called Tatlin's Tower. I can remember them, and they looked, very dated and things like that. Well, at the time they looked, and other people were basically, the literary world was trying to grapple with the legitimacy of online or digital publication at that time. This is before, portable readers and things of that nature. And so, almost initially back then, this is a long time ago, there was some hesitancy, the classic means by which, literary greatness was anointed, whether it's through, Best American or Pushcart or the NEA grants or things like that. It was very traditional, like you had to be in a print magazine, which was a little strange because once you got your foot in the door and actually started to get readership online, it would dwarf the traditional readership of a very prestigious print mag. And so for a little while, it was a little bit us versus them, but quickly print magazines realized that they needed to have an online presence. Digital magazines, maybe started putting out collectible print editions. And there was almost kind of a merger of the two.
Yeah.
And then, it was a bit pathetic because there was a hesitancy at first, but then you realize that you're clamoring over kind of a small readership compared to other forms of media. But that's, it was a big deal when Fail Better got into the Best American. It was a big deal for us. It seemed a certain degree of recognition, even though that wasn't really what we were in it for.
Yeah. When did that happen?
That happened back in the early 2000s, like 2006 or something.
Oh, okay. So
then we've been, recognized in Pushcart previously, and the magazine's changed significantly. It is different now than what it was, and it's gone through several, and it's going through yet again another significant redesign. And so, since we've been around for that long, there have been multiple players involved, and every time there's someone new, the magazine can kind of go in a different direction.
Yeah. So is 2006 like around when you started to see the tide turning toward online publications?
Yeah, very much so. I would say 2006, 2008. There were things that were originally knocked against online publication that kind of got addressed, right? Because, people started to recognize it. Those awards that I mentioned, there was a practical, like ephemeral kind of feel to it that people were like, well, what happens if it goes offline? And then, fortunately, the archivists, the people who preserve these things, everyone was going digital back by then. And I'm talking about, to be perfectly frank, more important kind of publications than literary magazine. I'm talking about medical and other things. And so, they had to learn how to archive this permanently, so it couldn't go the way of the dodo and just magically disappear. And I think once those things started to happen, then it knocked a lot of the stereotypes and the walls down there for would-be writers, beginning writers, and even established writers, to really, now realize that, oh yeah, it's actually beneficial. I'm going to get a larger readership and my name and my work out there. I mean, Fail Better, as I was saying now, Fail Better is different now than it was, I would say, back in really kind of a more of its heyday, in the sense that back then we were very much utilizing or tapping into well-known authors in addition to emerging talent. And one reason why we got to convince those kind of better known authors was that it was basically PR and press for them and their work. I mean, the fact that we would do an interview with a National Book Award winner or what have you, and that person could then, this is very early on, right? This is early on in the online literary world. But back then, people were like, oh yeah, then they're just going to click my new book and my Amazon and buy it off of Amazon. And that was kind of the allure to get folks. And this is really almost before authors themselves were tasked with their own PR in terms of their social media presence. So it was just kind of part of that.
So it's changed now in the sense that, are you more focused on emerging writers?
Yes, very much so. I mean, I'm still, on the masthead, still involved. But I would say in the last 6 or 7 years, the magazine has really we shifted formats too. I think, you'd ask like another reason why we changed. Initially, even the people that were getting into online magazines were still using a very much print mentality. They were having issues, like it was a quarterly, we were a quarterly. And a while ago, we realized, because you can access how people read the magazine, right? And we saw that when we were publishing like a bunch of works in one issue, it would get a lot of readers initially, and then it would be kind of like silence, right? Although back issues, some people would do Google search and find an author that they liked. And the great thing about online is there's no such thing as a backlist. It's always, prevalent or there. So then we switched the way we published, and we started publishing every other week, just one item, and that would culminate in an issue. And when we started doing that, it greatly changed our readership. And when we started doing that as well, our our editorial kind of slant moved towards, there's a lot of people giving a lot of kind of limelight or space for the already established artists. And we're just going to start picking and kind of focusing on emerging talent.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Is that still your publishing schedule now, every other
week? It is. So yeah, there'll be, whether it's and it's pretty much limited to fiction or poetry at present, and there's a new work every other week that goes up, even though we already have material accepted for
right.
for like a year in advance, but it's a lot of work for our managing editor Joe Woods to kind of slate it all and make sure it's all goes up and on the right schedule.
Yeah. And so do you still encounter people who have that hesitation about online publishing, or do you think that's totally gone now?
I wouldn't say it's totally gone, but it's kind of a rarity, right? And I get it to a certain degree. I mean, anyone who goes into this endeavor of creative writing, whether it's CNF, fiction, poetry, what have you, they tend to be, even though we were just talking about getting new computers and stuff, you tend to kind of be a Luddite in the sense that you still appreciate the smell of a book, the feel of a book.
Of course, yeah.
And so I think authors still have that kind of concept or identity, and it's particularly beginning writers. They want to be able to say, hey, here's a copy of blank, and be able to show it. Although the irony now is, and now we're living in a life remote, right? So you actually would have a hard time giving someone a book.
Right.
I'm involved with a couple of National Literary Awards from multiple publishers, Cabell First Novels, and they've even gone from like no one even. We have a hard time getting judges the books. So like actually I don't want a physical copy of the book. Just send it. Send me the Mobi file or send me the PDF. So it very much has changed. So I don't think we run into, and answer your question, I don't think we run into that too much anymore. And I don't see, and there's so much out there that if they have that feeling, they don't need to submit to us. That's fine.
So you mentioned that the reason you started online was because you were cheap. But was there also a kind of philosophical reason behind it, where you sort of like, we want to do something maybe more counterculture, counter to the mainstream? Was there more of a rebellious spirit to it? And is that part of the ethos of the magazine?
It was, but it was really aesthetic bound, right? So
yeah,
what we thought is we could take a weird or different aesthetic and get it a larger audience because of the platform, and so that was the philosophical. And you're right, the practical would have been cheap, but it was also the practical, as I said, observations. I saw folks dropping a lot of money on a print run, and then those magazines kind of going out into the ether and never really finding readers and ending up in used bookstore bins and things like that. So it was kind of a combination of the two. There were, and my day job, I should admit, is that I'm a teacher, and I teach actually one course on literary editing and publishing, and spend a decent amount of time kind of tracking the modern history of literary publication. And there were a lot of online magazines. This is a dated technology, but this is back really, I would say, in the first decade of the 2000s, that were completely enamored with the digital, with the platform, and they probably went overboard. You had like poems being published with songs.
Yeah.
You had visual interpretations of text that were so far off that it actually, you're like, what's this have to do with the story? And a lot of bells and whistles, to be perfectly honest. We were never of that sort or that game. But the one thing that we learned very early on is that we could use the technology to the author's benefit and to the reader's benefit. So, like behind the scenes, we knew what was being read and what wasn't. We knew, that someone read this story, and because we put tags on it, then we could like, the person reading it would be like, oh, well, if you like this story, this would naturally generate, right? And so we were using the technology more behind But I would have to say that Fail Better is definitely more traditional in the execution of the digital platform than there are plenty other ones they're pushing the envelope. I remember, a big splash with Electric Lit back in maybe 2015, and they were doing some pretty interesting stuff. And before that, there was a great magazine called Born magazine that ran for about 10 years. That had some amazing kind of digital stuff. We just tend to use it more to kind of track you all, the readers, and for the benefit of what we think are for the writers.
So that's interesting. Do you use that tracking, sort of like a data algorithm to some degree, to shape the kind of work that you accept? Like if you see a particular type of story, let's say like a personal family story is getting a lot of hits, does that mean that you're more likely to accept that kind of work, or do you try to not let it influence you?
I would say that that has not occurred in terms of the influence on the editorial. The editorial still tends to be kind of driven by the aesthetic, but we will take a look at what is being read and what isn't, and an attempt maybe to kind of see, it has affected. Actually, I guess I'll stand corrected. There was a time also too that everything on a computer screen or an online or digital platform had to be kind of short.
Yeah.
Brief, because just people weren't engaging the screen for long periods of time. This is completely generationally changed, by the way. But at the time, but one weird thing that we noticed was like, oh no, this one's been engaged. This one has retained the reader's attention, because you can also tell the duration of the visit. So you can tell if it's like a bot, or it's like a computer just looking at all the things, or if it's an actual person engaged in the text. And so because of that, we started we took a 19th century concept, serialization, and then applied it to the 21st century. And so we started publishing novellas, things that don't have a place fiscally in the market, right? And or longer works, even if it's like a longer or a novel excerpt or things like that. And like even in the current format, if we do that, we'll publish just an excerpt from 1 week and then give the person a week to two to read it, and then part two, and then so we started serializing things. That was entirely done because we did track and use the technology. But in terms of like the aesthetic of what we publish, I don't think that's we just haven't done that, and I don't think we would.
Yeah. And have you noticed people coming back for part two of the novella and part
yes.
two?
Yes. So and we used to run like a novella contest and things of that nature as well. So
So let's cover the basics actually. So you publish fiction, sounds like fiction of any length.
Yes, of any length. I mean, yes, I would say of any length, because if it's long enough, we'll serialize it.
Okay.
But we're also not going to publish an entire novel or anything.
Right. So there is a limit, maybe.
Yeah, I think the longest serialization that we've ever done was like a 6-parter or 4-parter.
Oh wow. Okay.
And it's been a little while since we've done something like that.
Yeah.
But we can and will break it up just for the sake of the readership too.
Okay. And you publish poetry
as well. And typically when we publish poetry, historically we had published poetry, like all the poems of one writer at one time. Now we may stagger it, but generally speaking, when we accept poetry, it's usually a couple of it's 2 or 3 poems of a poet as opposed to just one.
Okay.
And when you're submitting, you should submit a batch, is what I'm saying.
Right. Okay. And visual art.
Visual art is something that we used to do and was quite dedicated to for about 15 years. And then we stopped doing that in conjunction. Also, we used to do interviews. But in our new platform that will probably debut a year from now, I do believe that we're going to reinvigorate and restart both the visual art and probably the interviews as well. Although we're going to simplify the interviews. It may be the same 5 questions for and it may shift to the news portion of the thing. But visual art right now, we no longer publish, but I think that is going to change.
Okay. And no creative nonfiction.
Not intentionally. We found out that we've done it unintentionally. But no, we have periodically done like a special thing, but generally speaking, that's not our bailiwick.
Okay. So I interviewed an editor last week, and he referred to failbetter, and you were the OG of online magazines. So what would you say is like the secret sauce? What makes a lit mag into, I mean, 20 years for an online, it's incredible. So what would you say is what's sustained the magazine, and what's made it it's, I mean, considered like one of the top online magazines?
Well, maybe to our own detriment, pretty early on, we realized that none of us should quit our day jobs, and that this was probably going to be, regardless of the nonprofit status or potential for fundraising and things like that, that we weren't going to make a living off of this. And because we came to that realization, I think early on, it became a labor of love, and for anyone involved. And again, it's shifted, and we have different people involved. And I should mention, David McClendon, who was the cohort, Andrew Day. There's a lot of people who gave a lot of time and years to the magazine over that time. But I think, to a certain degree, because we had that attitude, we didn't really care that we couldn't quit our day jobs, that the magazine was able to sustain itself. It probably could and should be more profitable. We probably should have been more savvy, but we've even seen people with success do that, and then it pans out, it flames out after 4 years or 5 years, and we were like, nah, this is good. In fact, in a weird way, we wanted to, and I think the other thing that it's done on a practical level is we kept it small in scope, and because of that, the work gets a readership, but we don't have to. It doesn't have to be too labor intensive in terms of our time. Yeah.
This is sort of a weird question. It may seem a little personal, but do you have any regrets or things that you wish you had done differently over, 2 decades? It's such a learning curve for how to run a magazine. Yeah.
Well, I think if you talk to anybody in the lit mag world, their regret is the fact that 9 times out of 10 they're not actually making a living off of doing what they're doing. And I think there was some business opportunities for when the magazine was probably at a greater deal of readership than it currently is, where we probably could have and should have passed the ball, really gone for it, so to speak. But now that ship sailed so long ago that I don't hold any regrets in that regard at all. And now, I think we need to bring in some new blood in terms of the publishing side and in terms of the editorial side, and it's always a challenge. I think the other thing too is that the look of a magazine, it's strange. I think readers are very happy to have some traditionality with the way things look physically, but things not when it comes to the digital, and things can get old and look dated very time. And so, we've gone through 4 revisions. We're going to have to do it again. And the strange thing is now everything is like sleek and simple. It's no longer a big hip on design, and they're really making it. And I think it's because, a significant portion of the reader base are reading it on, these kind of things. They're not reading it on, I'm looking at a computer right now. And because of that, the design aspect, now when I get someone to redesign the magazine or what they're doing right now, I look at it, I'm like, this looks like so simple. It doesn't, to me, like, where do the ads for the NEA or Coca-Cola or whatever, where's the flash? And it's not like that anymore. So thankfully I'm not the the person designing it. So, because if it was, we'd be in worse trouble.
So let's talk about the writing. What is a failed better story?
You know, we used to have, I think we're still on the submission guidelines. It's like, know that what you submit could only come from you. And it was funny. Recently, someone wrote a critique about that, not in a bad way, but they were kind of identifying, and they said that, you know, a lot of the material was, they thought when they read the magazine was coming from a personalized slant or based on personal experience or what have you. And I never really thought about it like that. We prided ourselves initially in like kind of the eclectic versus the dynamic. And dynamic, by that I mean like one type of writer. And I think the magazine initially started out, as I mentioned, with one type of writing, kind of weirder and more esoteric, pushing the boundaries in terms of maybe even form. And then I think an attempt to reach a larger readership, we went the other way. We went eclectic. So, and that's the way that it's been for over a decade now. So I do think that it's a little hard for me to answer, like, what specifically, you know, do you look for in terms of voice when it comes to on the fiction side of things, or on the poetry side of things, which I'm not really too heavily involved with. So I would say that it does have a traditional literary bent. It's none of this is being viewed with any kind of commercial kind of assessment. And so we are looking for a voice, but we're looking for a voice probably not in the first person typically, but we do first person POVs. And the story has to start with a particular intrigue that sustains itself to the end. Some might think that is then emphasizes more of a strange approach, but you know, we've done contemporary traditional literary as well as, you know, a short or something stranger and more bizarre. So you know, the easiest thing, of course, for any would-be writer is just basically take a look. And if you can't find something that hits home with you over the last 2 years of the publication, then, you know, we're not the right publication to submit to.
Yeah. So when you say eclectic, does that mean that you try to diversify like what you've published last week versus the next week? I'm curious how you have, as I know in a print journal, the editors think a lot about how the pieces speak to one another.
Yeah.
So how does that work in an online magazine? And if you're publishing every other week, how do you try to get the pieces in communication?
Yeah. To us, it's the same process, but it's more of a think in terms of form. I think of scheduling. So, you know, so instead of saying, okay, this is all part of one collection, let's see what's on you turn the page, what's the next one, and putting it in some sort of order on the basis of a presentation at once. We're taking a look at the schedule and organizing. So the schedule's not based on like when your work was accepted, which is good news or bad news, because sometimes people are waiting to get accepted. Right. Or they've been accepted, but they're waiting for the work to get published. Instead, it's like, okay, well, we can't put, you know, these 3 stories, which they're not identical or anything, but they're too similar. Let's spread them out. And so that's where the eclectic nature comes in. It's when we schedule it. And as I mentioned, you know, we have material accepted really for the next year, and we're accepting that far in advance. So we have the luxury of being able to take a work and then say, oh, this would be great. And it's also, believe it or not, seasonal. Like, you know, if there's a story that's, you know, set on Halloween, we will shamelessly move it up in the schedule. And not that we're accepting a lot of Halloween stories or anything like that, but it has an input. But we're doing the same thing that you would think of in terms of an issue or a collection, but we're doing it behind the scenes by scheduling it when it comes out.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So do you work with writers to edit their pieces, or do you pretty much take the work as is?
we have different gradations of acceptances, and I would say that when we were first doing this, we were very hands-on. In fact, we have some classic examples of, like, writer-editor relationship gone awry and things of that nature. I would say now that I would say 75% of the time we are not editing or we're copy editing everything, but we're not making substantive edits or changes. But then maybe about 25% of the time we will accept a work pending their approval of our edits. And in some cases, that tends to very much be more with fiction than to be frank, than with poetry. But in some cases, it's just simply like, have you ever thought that this story should start here and end here? But other times it can be line edits along those lines. We got into the thing because we enjoyed editing, and I would have to say that we are more hands-off now, much more hands-off now than we were in the magazine the first decade that it was done.
And you mentioned seasonal writing, so I was wondering if you've seen more like COVID. So are people writing?
Yeah.
It's funny.
So.
Some editors.
It's always, over the years, it's always there's a stylistic thing that comes into play, and there's always a substantive thing,
right?
And so yes, we have gotten in the last loads of COVID stories, loads of COVID poetry,
right?
Because it's dominating probably the writer's mind, right? I mean, the only good thing is that writers tend to live kind of secluded lives to begin with, so maybe they're not as impacted as most when it comes to the remote world that we're living in. But and it's interesting too, because it's being applied on a generational thing. We'll get stories probably from someone quite young or removed from high school or things like that, and just they've gone through that experience, or they're clearly using that experience in a more fictional plot way.
Yeah, it's so interesting because you must see, like, you sort of have your finger on the pulse of what people really feel and what they're going through to some degree. Like, to be an editor during this time, you're getting access to a lot of people's thoughts. And can you give any insight into like what people are you seeing? Are the stories full of frustration or longing, or what are people writing about?
I would say there's a great deal more of isolation.
Yeah.
Right. And so both in terms of poetry and fiction, in terms of what the characters are feeling or doing.
Yeah.
We've definitely seen an uptake in that. We get so many submissions, so sometimes they're just not appropriate for it. In fact, I would say 9 times out of 10 it's just a question of a match more than rejection because of quality. Though that happens too. And so we'll get also anger, some angry stuff, not directed at us, but just at life. Sure. And so, but I would say more in terms of isolation, and we've always been literary, so it's probably clearly more character driven than plot driven. But now we've gotten even probably more stories of people trapped in their own mind and their own characters. Maybe there's not enough action, which is always the plague against literary fiction sometimes. And I think that's been probably exacerbated by our lives under COVID.
That's really interesting. And I completely forgot my next question. Oh yeah, but what are your, because you mentioned rejection. So tell us your common reasons for rejection.
The most common is really we're just not the right venue for it. So like, for a number of years, I think we still are, I don't even know if they still have like the novel and short story market and things of that nature. And so, someone would submit like a Western or something, it just, we're not the right venue for that. So that would probably be the number one reason. And then, usually every work has got 2, 3, 4 sets of eyes on it.
Mhm.
And as I said, we have like a rejection system in a way, and so it's, thanks but no thanks, better luck elsewhere.
Yeah.
Not this, but we liked this. And then some other kind of rejections are simply because we have indeed just published or have several things already slated that are somewhat similar, either stylistically or substantively.
Mhm.
Like, oh, we can't publish another second person point of view story type of deal.
Yeah.
And so it's no reflection over their execution or this quality of the work. It's just simply that, we actually not only just did that, but we have another, it's usually more. It's not just one, right? Because the writers who do their research will be like, okay, I read this magazine, man, I really like this piece. They must like this type of thing. I have something that's of that ilk. And we understand that. So we will be probably more inclined editorially to take a look and be attracted to something like that. It's just more of a question of like, okay, we just did that, but we have 2 or 3 others that are already lined up. So
yeah, so that's interesting, because if you're seeing kind of a glut of pandemic stories, do you have any advice for writers who maybe want to write about this topic? Obviously, a lot of people are thinking about it, but they don't want to just be part of, this inundation. So do you have any advice for like how they can approach it in a way that will stand out?
Yeah, I think it doesn't necessarily just apply to COVID or any topic.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, are you using that topic in a original manner? It may not be the focus of your poem or your story or what have you, but is there enough authenticity there? And then is there something original? Are you saying something original? Not necessarily about COVID, but are you using it to say something original? So it can be based on your experience. It can be, entirely from your mind, imaginary, so to speak. It's the originality, I think. And I think, so in terms of acceptance, it's basically, if you think it's original and, apologize. And then we do, then you've got your match, right? So you should not be no one should be writing thinking like, I'm writing specifically for this to get it published. I mean, I think hopefully every writer thinks that they're being original or they bring something new to it. And then you're just trying to match it with an editor who agrees with you.
Yeah, that's a good point. I
don't have any, there's no magic pill or there's nothing like that.
Yeah.
So the picture I sent you, I saw you were reading somebody's message.
This picture I saw.
Oh, I hear him, somebody else.
And I forgot to mention early on, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them into the chat and I will.
Oh yeah, let me take that up. My apologies.
But yeah, I noticed in the submission guidelines that you want work that is both, it says personal and original. And I'm curious, like, how do you define a work that's personal? What do you mean by that? Like that probably not that it needs to be autobiographical, but
it doesn't have to be autobiographical, but we do think that it's revelatory, right? There's something emotional behind the work that exposes the writer. And I think the brilliance, or the reason why we would prove that, is that I think writing to a certain degree is an egotistical art, but it's an art in which that you're wearing yourself on your sleeve. And the kind of brilliant thing, I think, particularly I guess if we're mentioning COVID or this thing, is that you're going to find like-minded souls who appreciate that. And so that's what we're talking about. Like, if you put yourself out there, guess what? You're going to find that you're not alone. And that in the literary world, that results in readership. And in the practical world, that results in companionship. So it's that we're talking about.
What is your editorial process? It sounds like there are 3 of you.
Well, it's all remote, right? So and it will change. Right now, we're actually going to be in a major shift of editors. So traditionally speaking, we would have 2 to 3 editors in each genre. There's one submission system. We actually have we don't use submishmash not submishmash, but submittable. Our managing editor just basically, because we didn't want to charge anybody. That's always been our key. So we have our own system right on the website that you just have to register for, but it's free. And so our editors log in. They will weigh in with critiques and comments on any given work. Our editors they can reject work without it running by anybody, me or the other people. And then we just try to, each of those genre people try to come to a consensus about something. And then and then I would say in our submissions right now, I don't know the totals numbers. Back in when I was actually more hands-on with the submission process, it was like about 3,000 for fiction, 3,000 for poetry, and 2,000 for fiction in a year.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's still in that realm, but that's kind of it. And so I don't know what our acceptance rates or things like that, but it's not a big operation. Most ironically are not, right? You think, you're looking at the Paris Review or something, you think they must have a mega team. It's like, no, it's 3 or 4 people working on one thing, 3 or 4 people working on another, and then another 3 or 4 people that are helping actually run the thing.
Right.
And that's kind of it. And we're going to be actually looking for, I think, editors in that regard.
Oh, do tell. Are you going to put out a call, or will it just sort of be like an internal?
Yeah, I think so. I think because otherwise it gets a little incestuous in the sense that you're constantly utilizing or using people that right? That through life experience, and not that it can be broad based in the sense that if we go to AWP and you've got writers, and I work for an MFA program, we have graduates. I never have students worker, but graduates who later go on. Other writers that you have published that we've brought in as editors after. We never publish our own kind of writing, but I think that now. And I probably shouldn't say this out loud because we still have to discuss this, but I think we're going to have kind of an open call in which we may say, okay, if you're interested in we're going to try to lay it out there. It's like, this is what you'd have to do every 2 to 3 weeks. You need to log in, do this, this, and this. You'll be responsible for accepting this number of things. And then maybe we'll look at people's CVs and resumes and say, okay, and maybe give them a couple works to give an assessment to. But I do think that that is something we're going to open up because it might also be good in terms of diversifying the material, which is to be perfectly frank, the biggest challenge in publishing, whether it's a small lit magazine or the big 5 or big 4 or whatever they call themselves these days, is trying to diversify the editorship.
So if people want to follow and find out about that call for editors, how should they keep in touch?
How should they do that? I think, one thing is to check out the magazine. The other thing, I think that call will probably go out in multiple venues, but not the least of which would be in the news section of the magazine that will probably post that. Again, I may be getting ahead of myself in the sense that this might not be something that's done until the summertime. Because right now, I think the main thing is the actual redesign of the magazine. But yeah, that would be the call. And I have to be honest, we get contacts all the time from typically their current MFA students or MFA grads that are looking to, they're like, hey, are you looking for readers? Are you looking for editors? I'm interested. And so if someone was interested in that, not just with us, but believe it or not, that's you can make inroads by what you would think of as the writer's query, but it's a query not to get published, but instead to be part of their efforts.
Are you open to readers?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
so
we will be. That's where I think we're talking about.
Oh,
and although we had readers, we have had readers. Now, in all honesty, I think, because it's a labor of love, we're going to, call them editors and call it a day. So we don't have that, it's not that big of a hierarchy in that regard.
Okay. Well, you'll have to let me know so I can announce it in the newsletter.
Oh, I'll absolutely do that.
That'd be great. So you mentioned there are changes coming. Can you talk more about that?
Well, I think we need an influx of personnel, and the biggest change is the redesign of the magazine.
Okay.
And then probably the absorption of a rather lengthy, like 2 decades of an archive into that redesign. So it's a really, really big project, and I really can't speak too much of it because our managing editor Joe Woods is really spearheading that, who lives in Philadelphia, by the way. And so I think that is the idea and the ideal right now, and then spearheading, or kind of, that will be the catalyst to re-energize the personnel behind the magazine.
Okay. And I'm curious because you have a unique perspective of just having seen the scene change, the lit mag scene change so much over 2 decades. And I'm curious, what is your view of so many lit mags now on the market? Do you feel like it's a great thing? Do you feel like it's, making it harder for lit mags to get readership? What is your, and not just the multitude of lit mags, but just like any insights you have about how the lit mag culture has changed? Yeah.
I think, the irony is I would say, as much as you might think that the multitude of magazines or the multitude of writers in a proliferation of, MFA grads and other things have invited kind of some indifference to it all, I would actually, now having, with some benefit of hindsight, realize that those arguments have been made for decades. And even if you're talking about literary magazines, there was a ton of them back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and it goes through cycles. And then something as dated as the online magazine, which is really kind of basically turn of the century, early 2000s, which now is very dated, right? At that time there were loads, and so I don't really concern myself too much with that there's too many writers or there's too many magazines. And then if you really start looking at the numbers, right, you were concerned that there, in a weird way, there's like more publishers and more writers than there are readers.
Yeah.
And all you have to do is, people have been preaching doom and gloom for publishing and for readership for decades. So I think the more the merrier. And this is a very politically incorrect thing to say, but I don't believe that the kind of readership that reads literary works has ever been, nor will it ever be, a majority of folks. And so, for this kind of venture, for literary works, a literary magazine that traditionally, traditional print literary magazines would only have a circulation of, some 3,000, some 5,000, whatever, not a lot, right? Even the most prolific, literary magazine, print is probably poetry magazine. I don't know how many subscribers there are, but I mean, you compare that to how many Instagram followers someone has, right, it's dwarfs, right? So, I think that any publisher can find readers, and any writer can find their voice and find readers, just, as long as you're not, concerned about being the bestseller.
And after 20 years, what keeps you doing this work? Because you're a writer yourself. You're a reader occasionally.
I was a writer. I know.
Oh, you don't write anymore.
No. Pretty. I think. What is that famous? That famous quote: "Those who can't do teach; those who can't teach Jim." I think to a certain degree that applies to the publishing world, whether it's the big six in New York, or whether it's folks in everywhere across the country, across the world, that are running their own literary ventures. And so pretty early on, I decided, no, I'm actually pretty happy doing this. And so I did stop writing, but actually I think that might be one reason why I'm still doing it. So of course I lost what was the question?
Well, I was asking how you did it all. You're teaching, you're working.
Oh yeah. So no, that's it.
You know,
I mean, So it could be some heavy lifting in terms of giving the submissions their due, but that's it. That's the most labor intensive part, other than the things that I've already mentioned about, like, all right, now we really got to bring some people on board and we really got to redesign the magazine. That could be labor intensive. But now my day job is teaching, which I enjoy very much, and I enjoy constantly being exposed to just new people, new writers, and also you get old quickly in this business, so it's really nice to actually get new blood. And yeah, that's it. I mean, I work in academia too, so no joke. I mean, no offense, but it's not like, I'm not working in a coal mine, right? I'm not working, raising a kid and doing that kind of stuff. And it affords me that opportunity. My job really affords me the opportunity to do something like Fail Better too. So it's how we all choose to use our time in the creative aspect of our lives. And for me, it's not writing, but it has been constantly reading random stories and figuring out which ones I like and which ones I like to share with others.
Right. And I'm interested, was that moment a liberating experience to decide, you know what, I'm not interested in pursuing a career as
well, it was liberating after about 10 years of angst.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It took a while to get there.
Right.
It took a while to get there. I'm liberated now, but I had about 10 years, with major aspirations to return to the second or third failed novel. Yeah.
So when you're reading submissions, do you ever think, oh man, I want to do this again? Or is your thought process like, I'm so glad I'm not struggling?
Kind of both. Right. I think anyone who reads like that, one, they make like, oh, shit, I could do this better, or they think, wow, this kind of blows me out. This is why I can't. And then, but you do also, the cynical part of you realizes, being on the other side of things, how sometimes subjective and arbitrary success is. Right? It's like a story gets rejected not because it's bad, it's actually quite good. It might even be better than the story that they're accepting, but there are a multitude of other factors. And I think, on the editorial side, you can't but help but recognize how subjective and sometimes unjust that is. But so that actually might be a relief, because then you realize, oh yeah, that's why, my wall was plastered with rejection letters. It's because that's the way the system works. Yeah.
So is Fail Better open for submissions year round?
It is. Okay. It is open year round. We don't typically, the only time we'll close it is if we do have we're so far down the pipeline in terms of the acceptance thing. But no, it's because we're not, academically affiliated. So it's not that the readers are here for 9 months of the year or things like that. So, so yeah, it's open year round.
And any final words of advice for anyone watching at home and has a couple of poems or a story and they're thinking, I don't know if it's right.
Send them. That's the only way Send them, not just us, send them out. It behooves you to do your research. And there's no reason, back in the day, you would actually have to spend money to do that, right? You'd have to, track down these publications, but there's no need to do that. You can see you should be able to figure out what they're about, and then figure out whether your voice and the kind of work that you're doing might be a match. And then submit. Submit.
All righty. Well, so people can find you at failbetter.com.
Still.com, yeah. We used to be
Yeah.
failbetter.org, and but for now, yeah. Although it's
And-
hilarious because I think in the 20 years that we've been doing this, there are now other businesses. There's like a British game design company now called Failbetter.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Failbetter Games at UK, something like that. And
Yeah,
so we thought we had because it comes from the Beckett quote,
right.
but we thought we had a unique, but now they're like, yeah, there are multiple things called Failbetter, but yeah,
Yeah.
but we still own the .com, the .com sense.
So people should submit to
that's
you
where you would
and
find
not
us.
to the video game company. They should-
Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
And you're on Twitter at failbettermag.
Yeah, and we went through a phase where we were using social media, and we are kind of, I know this is probably not not the most business sense, but I know this might be a personal aesthetic decision by us, but we've kind of diminished that
Okay.
those efforts. But yeah, so just the easiest way is just to read the magazine Fail Better.
Yeah, check out the magazine. Okay, well, thank you so much. I really
Thank you
appreciate it.
for having me.
Yeah.